In 1924, two American teenage friends decided to embark on what they felt was a social experiment, which they thought they could get away with and not be detected. There are many motives and reasons for killing someone. They were Nathan Leopold, who was 19 years old, and Richard Lobe, 18. Both came from prominent, wealthy Chicago families, and they decided in 1924 to commit the perfect crime, driven by what they called an intellectual experiment, and for the thrill of designing all the facets of their crime of kidnap and murder, all with complete indifference to the intended victim. In their words, it was just an experiment. It is easy for us to justify as an entomologist is impaling a beetle on a pin. Chilling words. They wanted to demonstrate their superior intellect, which they felt entitled them to commit a perfect crime without having to face any consequences. Both came from very similar backgrounds, sharing some similar interests, and were brought up within a couple or so blocks of each other, although they only became friends in 1920. Nathan Leopold was born on the 19th of November 1904 in Chicago, the third son of a wealthy German immigrant family. As a child, he was considered to be of above-average intelligence. He began his college studies at the University of Michigan, but later returned home to study at the University of Chicago. He was planning to attend Harvard Law School after a trip to Europe. He was sensitive about his appearance and threw himself into intellectual pursuits which were remarkably successful. Richard Lobe was born on the 11th of June 1905, also in Chicago, the third of four sons. His father was a wealthy lawyer and retired vice president of Sears and Roebuck. Like Leopold, Lobe was exceptionally intelligent. He was an avid reader, with a passion for history and crime stories. Aged 12, he entered the innovative University High School. With the encouragement of his governess, he completed his high school education in 2 years. In 1923, at the age of 17, he would become the University of Michigan's youngest graduate. Following this, he enrolled in a few history classes at the University of Chicago. He was not as strictly intellectual as Leopold, but was seen as being more sociable. Shortly after they had met, the pair's friendship turned sexual, and they also started committing petty crimes together. Leopold was more interested in law-breaking as an intellectual exercise, demonstrating his superiority. He was also eager to maintain his romantic relationship with Lobe, sometimes promising to act as an accomplice in exchange for sex. In November 1923, the pair robbed Lobe's former fraternity house at the University of Michigan. Leopold wanted to rob a second house too, but Lobe was reluctant. Neither heist was particularly successful, and the two friends argued on their drive back to Chicago. Emboldened, they progressed to a series of more serious crimes, including arson, but no one seemed to notice. Disappointed with the absence of media coverage of their deeds, they decided to plan and execute a sensational perfect crime that would gain public attention and confirm their self-perceived status as being superior. They agreed a plan to carry out a kidnapping of a younger teenager, ransom and murder that would prove their genius and cement their bond at a pivotal moment in their relationship. The two concocted a plan involving false identities with elaborate backstories and decoy bank accounts, a bundle of cash thrown out of the window of a moving train, and a killing method that would leave them both equally culpable for taking a life. They spent 7 months planning everything, from the method of abduction to disposal of the body. To obfuscate the actual nature of their crime and motive, they decided to make a ransom demand and devised an intricate plan for collecting it, involving a long series of complex instructions to be communicated, one set at a time, by phone. They typed the final set of instructions involving the actual money drop in the form of a ransom note, using a typewriter previously stolen from the fraternity house. After a lengthy search for a suitable victim, who had to be wealthy enough to ensure his family could pay the ransom, looking mostly around the Harvard School for Boys, where Leopold had been educated, the pair decided on Bobby Franks, the 14-year-old son of a wealthy Chicago watch manufacturer and a neighbor of Lobe's. The pair put their plan into action on the afternoon of the 21st of May 1924, using a car that Leopold had rented under the name of Morton Ballard. They offered Franks a ride as he walked home from school. The boy initially refused, as he was less than 2 blocks away from where he lived, but Lobe persuaded him to get in the car to discuss a tennis racket that he had been using. Lobe struck Franks on the head several times from behind with a hammer, as the victim was sitting in the front passenger seat, then dragged him into the back seat and gagged him, which is where he died. With the body out of sight on the floor of the back seat, the men drove to their predetermined dumping spot near Wolf Lake in Indiana, 25 miles south of Chicago. When darkness had fallen, they removed and discarded Frank's clothes, then concealed the body in a culvert along the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks north of the lake. To obscure the body's identity, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face. By the time the two had returned to Chicago, word had already spread that Franks was missing. Leopold called Frank's mother, identifying himself as George Johnson, and told her that Franks had been kidnapped and that the instructions for delivering the ransom would follow. They posted a typewritten ransom letter demanding $10,000 in cash. It arrived the following morning and advised the Franks family to remain at home after 1 p.m. and ensure that the telephone was not in use, as they would provide further instructions. After posting the typed ransom note and burning their blood-stained clothing, as well as cleaning the bloodstains from the rented vehicle's upholstery, they spent the remainder of the evening playing cards. When the Franks family received the ransom note the following morning, Leopold called a second time and dictated the first set of instructions for the ransom payment. The intricate plan stalled almost immediately when a nervous family member forgot the address of the store where he was supposed to receive the next set of instructions, and it was abandoned entirely when news came the following morning that Frank's body had been found by a Polish immigrant, stuffed into a drainage culvert. Leopold and Lobe destroyed the typewriter and burned a blanket they had used to move the body, before carrying on with their lives as normal. The men had hoped Franks' body would never be found, or at least not until decomposition had set in. The remains' rapid recovery prevented the pair from collecting the ransom. The hydrochloric acid had done little to disfigure the corpse. Newspapers covered the discovery of an unknown boy's remains, announcing his identification as Bobby Franks, later that same day. Chicago police launched an urgent investigation, and rewards were offered for information. Both Leopold and Lobe enjoyed chatting with friends and family members about the murder. Leopold even discussed the case with his professor and a female friend, joking that he would confess and give her the reward money. The police found a pair of glasses near Frank's body. Although common in prescription and frame, they were fitted with an unusual hinge purchased by only 3 customers in Chicago, one of whom was Leopold. When queried about this, Leopold offered the possibility that his glasses might have dropped out of his pocket during a birdwatching trip the previous weekend. Leopold and Lobe were summoned for formal questioning on May the 29th. They both claimed that on the night of the murder, they had picked up 2 women in Chicago using Leopold's parents' car and then dropped them off sometime later near a golf course without learning their last names. Their alibi was exposed as a fabrication when Leopold's chauffeur told police that he was repairing the car when the men had claimed to be using it. The chauffeur's wife confirmed that it was parked in the Leopold's garage on the afternoon of the murder. But as the investigators kept digging, they uncovered another piece of evidence. Leopold's maid had recently seen a typewriter like the one used to write the ransom note, though it had since disappeared from the family home. Confronted with these inconsistencies, Lobe confessed to the killing early on the morning of May the 31st. Leopold made a similar statement shortly after. The destroyed typewriter was recovered from the Jackson Park Lagoon on June the 7th. Lobe, in his confession, claimed that Leopold had planned everything and had killed Franks in the back seat of the car while he drove. Leopold's confession followed on swiftly after, but insisted that he was the driver and Lobe the murderer. Their confessions otherwise corroborated most of the evidence in the case. Leopold later claimed, long after Lobe was dead, that he pleaded in vain with him to admit to killing Franks. The police believed that Leopold did strike the fatal blows. Some circumstantial evidence, including testimony from an eyewitness who claimed he saw Lobe driving and Leopold in the back seat minutes before the kidnapping, suggested that Leopold could have been the killer. Both admitted that they were driven by their thrill-seeking, delusions, and their aspiration to commit a perfect crime. Neither claimed to have looked forward to the killing, but Leopold admitted interest in learning what it would feel like to be a murderer. The families of both Leopold and Lobe hired the renowned criminal defense lawyer Clarence Darrow. The 2 suspects underwent extensive interviewing by doctors and psychologists while awaiting trial, a fact that led the prosecution team to believe that Darrow would argue they were not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead, the lawyer changed the pair's plea to guilty. Darrow's shift in strategy reflected his belief that Judge Caverly, who had a reputation as one of the court's more liberal justices, would find it much harder to order the executions of 2 teenagers than a jury of angry Chicagoans would. By pleading guilty, Darrow urged Caverly to consider 3 mitigating factors: the pair's youth, their guilty plea, and their mental state. The trial of Leopold and Lobe at Chicago's Cook County Criminal Court became a media spectacle. One reason defense lawyer Darrow took the case was because he was a staunch opponent of capital punishment. While it was generally assumed that the men's defense would be based on a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, Darrow concluded that a jury trial would almost certainly end in conviction and the death penalty. So he decided to enter a guilty plea, hoping to convince Cook County Circuit Court Judge John Caverly to impose sentences of life imprisonment. The trial was technically an extended sentencing hearing, as their guilty pleas had already been accepted, and it ran for 32 days. The state's attorney, Robert Crowe, presented over 100 witnesses and documented every detail of the crime. The defense, on the other hand, presented extensive psychiatric evidence in an effort to establish mitigating circumstances. On the 23rd of August, approximately a month after the sentencing hearing began, Darrow delivered his closing argument that demonstrated his skill as a defense lawyer, often appealing directly to the judge. Darrow used Leopold and Lobe's case as a jumping-off point for a broader criticism of the death penalty. His impassioned 8-hour-long masterful plea at the conclusion of the hearing has been called one of the finest speeches of his career. Its principal arguments were that the methods and punishments of the American justice system were inhumane, and the youth and immaturity of the accused. The judge was eventually persuaded, but he explained in his ruling that his decision was based primarily on precedent and the youth of the accused. The judge took nearly 2 weeks to reach his verdict. When the court reconvened on the 10th of September, the judge praised the lawyer's careful analysis of Leopold and Lobe's mental state and life histories. His decision ultimately came down to one chief consideration: the defendant's youth. The judge sentenced both Leopold and Lobe to life imprisonment for the murder, and an additional 99 years each for the kidnapping. Although Leopold and Lobe might have welcomed their reprieve from hanging, the judge pointed out that the prolonged suffering of years of confinement may well be the severest form of retribution. The pair were initially held at Joliet Prison in Illinois. Although they were kept apart as much as possible, the two managed to maintain their friendship. Leopold was transferred to Statesville Penitentiary in 1925, and Lobe was transferred there 5 years later. Once reunited, the two expanded the prison school system, adding a high school and junior college curriculum. On the 28th of January 1936, 30-year-old Lobe was attacked by fellow inmate James Day with a razor in a shower room, and he died soon after in the prison hospital. Day claimed that Lobe had attempted to sexually assault him, but he was unharmed, while Lobe sustained more than 50 wounds, including defensive wounds on his arms and hands. His throat had been slashed from behind. A sexual motive for the killing was suggested, although 7 prison officials, including the warden, believed Lobe had been murdered. Day was found not guilty by a jury after a short trial in June. There is no evidence that Lobe was a sexual predator while in prison, but Day was later caught at least once in a sexual act with a fellow inmate. Leopold, despite suffering from depression, became a model prisoner and made many significant contributions to improving conditions in the prison. These including reorganizing the prison library, revamping the schooling system and teaching its students, and volunteer work in the prison hospital. In 1944, his autobiography, Life plus 99 Years, was published as part of his campaign to win parole. His book was on the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks, though some accused him of writing the book solely as a means of rehabilitating his public image by ignoring the dark side of his past. After 33 years and numerous unsuccessful petitions, Leopold was released on parole on the 13th of March 1958, aged 53. Eager to avoid the spotlight, he moved to Puerto Rico, where he'd received an offer of employment as a laboratory technician in a hospital. He married a widowed florist called Gertrude in February 1961. In later years, he earned a master's degree at the University of Puerto Rico, then taught classes there. He became a researcher in the social service program of Puerto Rico's Department of Health, worked for an urban renewal and housing agency, and carried out studies on leprosy at the University School of Medicine. He died of a diabetes-related heart attack on the 29th of August, 1971, at the age of 66.